Well, folks, I'm pretty excited today. It's like a kid in a candy store because I have the author of literally one of the best books I've read in the past 12 months, which I will highly recommend. But we'll talk about this. I have not had a chance to meet the author, Nathan Bardi, before, so it's a pleasure that he's taken some time of a busy schedule to be with us. Nathan, welcome to Healthcare Unfiltered. I really appreciate that you're taking the time. I know that you're probably getting called by a lot of people to talk about this book, deservingly so, because I think it is so well written, and we'll go over this. But before we get started, just a little bit about you. I don't think the biography in the folder of the book is giving you justice. Tell us a little bit about you.
Well, first of all, I'm really, really happy to spend some time with you and really appreciate your interest and endorsement of the book. So thank you very much. Um, I'm a traditionally a financial a journalist in New York with roots in the magazine business. I spent most of my career at Forbes magazine, and at Forbes, I was mostly responsible for the coverage of big investors, hedge funds, private equity, billionaires, that sort of thing. And it was a lot of fun for me, that job, because I got to cover a lot of different industries through an investment lens. So my world was not narrow, it was very, very wide. So I wouldn't, cover oil one day and someone who might be investing in healthcare the next day, technology, that sort of thing. And I really, really enjoyed it. And um, during that during the period between 2010 and 2020, the area that I most enjoyed covering was investments in biotechnology. I thought that biotechnology kind of epitomized the market. There was a kind of golden age of biotechnology during that period. And I just felt like, as much as I might enjoy Netflix, that that decade was when streaming services kind of came online, and I still do enjoy watching streaming shows with my family and with my wife from my couch. Like I think that's a terrific innovation. There was no industry that seemed to have as big an impact on the lives of human beings as biotechnology was having. There are 400 drugs that were approved in the United States approximately between 2010 and 2020. A large amount of those were oncology medications, and a large amount of them were produced by biotechnology companies where there were some very interesting investment stories behind them. So I really, really enjoyed that. Just to finish biographically, right now I'm at MarketWatch, which is the online network of the Wall Street Journal, where I am an enterprise editor. So I mostly edit enterprise work that is being done across the newsroom and in the group that I manage. But I love to write, and I'm still trying to write as well while I do that. When I see pockets, when I see opportunities to do it.
I have a feeling that the book that we are going to talk about, your book, should be a Netflix documentary that you would be watching with your wife on the couch. Um, so, I mean, in your world, and it's a world I watch from a distance, but I'm always fascinated by it. I mean, that's actually, I went back to business school to get a business degree. But in your world, you have so many of these stories, right? I mean, mergers, acquisitions, firing, hiring, companies bankrupt, companies go crazy. What was so special about this story that said, I'm going to spend a lot of time researching it and I'm going to write a book? Something was intrigued you, it seems like.
Um, You're right. I spent 3 years working on this book. And, back when I wrote only for magazines, sometimes I would get tired of my magazine articles that would take a few weeks, from the time I started into publication. So I absolutely knew that I needed a subject that would hold my attention for a long period of time. And there are a number of reasons why I wrote this book, but at its core, it's a really good story. And I think that's really the most important thing that attracted me to writing this book. It's just a great narrative, and it's an extreme example of the kind of things that we were seeing during this, what I view as this kind of golden age of biotechnology and biotechnology investment. And the characters were very, very extreme. They were very unique, and it's a great story in the sense that the outcome for patients here is not in debate. It's a terrific outcome for patients. So in a way, I'm reverse engineering, like, okay, how did this happen? And the two drugs that I write about in this book really have made a big difference. I'll tell you, when I went to the publishing houses and told them I wanted to write this book, a lot of the responses were, why do you want to write about these two blood cancer drugs? There are no commercials on television with these two blood cancer drugs. No one really knows about them outside of the people who take them. Why aren't you writing about Humira? And I would say, like, look, Humira is the biggest, at the time, was the biggest drug in the world. And I know that they have a huge advertising budget, but that story really isn't that interesting. Like, this story is a great story. And the other thing I'll share with you is that when I would tell people in the biotech industry I was writing this book, a few of them kind of were like a little like curious, like, why this story? But every time I spoke to someone who knew this story, I always got the same response, which was, I always knew someone was going to write a book about this because it's so wild and crazy. And when you hear that as a journalist, you kind of feel like I'm on the right track here.
Yeah. I mean, as somebody who treated patients with these drugs, I mean, as a medical oncologist and the hematologist who specialized in lymphoma and CLL, it was so close to heart, but I can tell you I did not know 90% of this. I knew the characters. In fact,
Right.
I interviewed Jeff Sharman for this because I've known him for a long time, and you mentioned him in the book.
Great guy, right? Just a wonderful, wonderful person. Yeah.
Great guy. So you decided to write a book about the story, and we'll go over the characters in a little bit because they're so animated. Like, I felt I knew them, and I'm not gonna lie, some of them I hated, some of them I liked. So you were able to actually portray them in a very well. But how much research did you need to do? Like, did you just say, I'm going to take a year off and I'm going to go fly around and meet people, interview people, do research? Because clearly, this is not, a lot of this is behind the scenes that you must have spent months and hours to research.
Yeah, the whole process from beginning to end took 3 years, and I had huge aspirations to travel in a plane and meet people and talk to them. And then the pandemic happened, and that actually turned out to be okay. I mean, I'm not a fan of the pandemic, believe me, but for that first period of the pandemic, I got a lot of work done because we were all home,
Yeah.
and that means all my sources were home, and they all had nothing to do. So I could call them and we would talk for hours and hours and hours. So it was actually, in a sense, it was a very unique time to be writing a book. But yeah, I took 6 months of leave from my job, mostly for the writing part of the book. The reporting I was able to do, while I was living my life. The pandemic helped with that. But for me, anyways, writing it all, like, I needed to tune everything else out and just focus on the writing, which I really, really enjoyed. So, it was a process that took 3 years. I knew some of it before, that I'd look in, that I, heard this story and learned a little bit about it. And it was just a lot of phone calls, a lot of reading, a lot of reaching out to people. I had a pretty high batting percentage as far as people who were willing to talk to me. It wasn't 100, it wasn't 1,000, but it was pretty high. And what I do a lot is try to corroborate information. You talk to one person, you hear their point of view. You talk to another person, and you try to triangulate what actually took place and corroborate it all. And it's science. A lot of this is scientific pursuit. So there's a lot that's open source. Whether it's clinical trials or papers. I mean, a lot of it's kind of out there. You just kind of have to piece it together.
Did you, I mean, there's a lot of timeline as I was thinking about how you wrote the story. I mean, you started from one of the major characters got fired, for example, and then you went back and you took us to a hospital scene when one of the major characters, Bob Duggan's son, was dying from a brain tumor. Um, did you? I was picturing you. I'm thinking, what is Nathan doing? So I literally pictured you in your office and have like a board and you have a line and you have like you're putting the dates and you're checking what happened in which date and then you went back and decide how you're going to tell the story. Am I off? Like, I mean, because so many things were happening in these 10 years.
I did storyboard the book at one point so that I could see it all. Part of the challenge here is that drug development takes a really long time. So it's not a story that happened in a year and a half, right? You're talking at least a decade usually, from bench to patient. So it's a long period of time, and you want to figure out what part of the story matters and what doesn't, and what you want to focus on and what is less important. And you're right, figuring out how to tell it from a time perspective was a challenge. I did storyboard it. At one point I actually wrote the book in two sections. And then with my editor, we looked at it and we thought, it kind of feels like there are two books here kind of slapped together, and the reader's going to like feel that. So we switched it to a three section format, which I thought was a good decision. And that's really what writing is about, is trying to make, you do the reporting, you can learn as much as you can, and then you try to make good decisions and make decisions about, what makes sense and what does not.
It's a story. You're an amazing storyteller. I mean, really, really, really amazing storyteller.
That's so
Because
kind of you to say.
yeah, but there are books like you. There is a book because I read a lot. There's a book like you read and you struggle to get through, and you realize you want to read it and you just can't. I couldn't put this one down. I could not.
Oh, that's great to
Um,
hear.
but I want to talk about Bob Duggan first, just a little bit.
Okay.
He's a very eccentric character. And as you could imagine, anytime you actually would mention a character, I go to Google and I check those people out and just try to see how they look because I was trying to imagine them. I felt like you danced around the idea of Scientology, but you never really got into it. Like you kind of teased me a little bit with it. Like you mentioned how he is in Scientology and believing. You even talked about how he would interview people to be hired by pharmaceutics. I felt like you were going back and forth, but you never really delved deep into the Scientology piece. So I wasn't sure, was that intentional? But he left me wanting to understand a little bit more how the Scientology piece played a role in some of his decision making as a chief executive officer.
So the book is about the development of two rival cancer drugs, right, that have really made a difference for patients. And it's not a book about Scientology. That was never what I wanted to write. And for this drug to come to get to patients, and this is to me the big takeaway, it required a lot of people to make indispensable contributions, right? No one person brings a cancer drug to market and gets it to patients. And there are a lot of different people that kind of are participate in this process in the book, and none of them could do this on their own. Bob Duggan was an indispensable part to this story, and he is a scientologist. He's not a scientist; he's a Scientologist, and the philosophy, the kind of self-help roots of Scientology are things that he embraces in his personal life and in his way of looking at the world and how he manages his company, the companies that he works on. And in my opinion, and through my reporting, I show this, he brings some of that into pharmaceutics, the company that he ends up leading as CEO that develops one of these drugs. And I wanted to acknowledge that and show that, and also show that for some people, there was a lot of discomfort around this at Pharmacyclics, and so I wanted to describe that, and I think I did. But I didn't want to start to get into a whole debate about how good, how bad Scientology is or isn't. To me, the point is that he played a role in this, and I wanted to, and Scientology played a role in his approach, and I just wanted to portray that as accurately and as honestly as possible.
Yeah, I see that now. I mean, I think could have been distracting if you went down that whole rabbit hole in terms of going through this. So I see it. You talk a lot about it's interesting. I mean, there's, as I was reading this, some of the things that I've seen were completely pure luck. Like, it makes you wonder about how much luck and serendipity plays a role in certain things that actually occur. There's one piece that I highlighted. I was reading the book, and for readers, they'll have to go and read this to understand it, but I'm not going to give it all away. But I find it amazing. Celera, which is a company, Celera decided to give up on all the drug development going on at its South San Francisco facility, including the work on BTK. Like, I mean, this is just completely, have they not done that, it would have been completely different. And it makes you wonder how much of this is really happening, how much of the science, luck, pontification, prediction. Take me through, as you learned this and as you learned more about this. I kind of felt bad for Celera.
Well, I think sometimes it's incredible when you think of all the billions of dollars and the number of talented people involved in drug development, and particularly cancer drug development. And luck plays a role. It just does. And it certainly did in this story. And I think gets to the root of why all of this is so hard. And it's so hard. The vast majority of drugs that are tested in patients fail. And a lot of times you only get one shot, so you could have a really great drug, and if you don't manage the clinical trial process properly, it still might not get to patients, because it's so expensive to do these things. If you get a few failures, then people might give up on it. So one of the ideas in this book that you can see, which is not isolated, is this idea of forgotten drugs. All right, and this became an investment strategy. Remember, I looked at a lot of this through an investment lens on Wall Street during the biotech boom. There are drugs, and there were drugs that are trapped in the pipelines of big companies and aren't being developed for different reasons, because of bureaucratic reasons, because of the processes of these companies, or because of bad luck. And some investors realize that it's possible to identify these drugs and fish them out of the big companies for like pennies on the dollar and develop them. And this book is about that. I mean, certainly the Celera drug, which was really sold for nothing, essentially. And with the other drug that I write about, which was developed by a company called Acerta, which was fished out of Merck for an upfront payment of $1,000. And today, last year, that drug generated $2.2 billion and has become the standard of care for CLL patients. Chronic lymphocytic leukemia patients was the most common form of adult leukemia, starting a BTK inhibitor. And there have been other examples of this. This is just, one example of it. And I think it also underlies, what a big role luck plays in cancer drug development.
There's also a lot in the book about, credits and who gets credits and why. And I've always thought this is the dark side of academia. It's also really the dark side of just how the world works. There are a couple of things I'd like you to reflect on, and I don't know how much you spend time with Richard Miller, But Richard Miller seems like, who was the previous CEO of Pharmacyclics before Duggan took over, if it wasn't for him, none of this would have happened. Is that a fair statement? I mean, and does he feel he was kind of, I mean, nobody really thinks of Richard Miller as instrumental in the development of ibrutinib, and probably until they read this book. What was your sense as you talked to Richard Miller and how he reflected on the development of BTK inhibitors?
I want to answer that question, but before I do, I think you hit on something that's really interesting that really struck me while I was reporting this book. This idea of credit. People want it. I really believe that people, when they're doing things the right way, are motivated by making contributions, but also being recognized for those contributions. And I feel that in the biopharma era, when it comes to drug development, there are a lot of people who really yearn for that recognition. They want it, and sometimes it's hard to come by. It's an interesting idea, and you see a lot of that in this book. People's names being left off of academic papers, for example, and feeling deeply hurt about it is one example. Money is another example that we could talk about later if you want. But again, many people played absolutely critical role in the development of ibrutinib, and Richard Miller is definitely one of them. I mean, he literally co-founded the company that developed it, so that's one thing. He acquired the drug itself. He made the decision to push that drug towards blood cancer as opposed to arthritis, which is what it was originally developed for by the chemist at Solera. And he also made an incredibly serendipitous decision, which I describe in the book, to include CLL in the phase 1 trial of ibrutinib. That was really a lymphoma trial. And he did that for practical reasons about, assays and how to get blood samples, as opposed to thinking that this drug was going to make a difference in CLL, which is the indication where it has made, in my opinion, the biggest difference. So that's a lot of luck again, but it's also showing you the critical role that Richard played in the development of this drug.
And then it was, I mean, I almost felt there was almost a coup. Like he was kind of like taken out by Duggan, and he was taken out because Duggan kept buying stocks in Pharmacyclics for the wrong reason. I mean, he was buying stocks, right, because he thought they're going to develop a brain tumor drug, and he kept trying to push for it, and then he was told no, no, no repeatedly. But I felt there was a coup, and then he left. Did you get a sense? Did Richard Miller not want to stay? Like, did he just didn't think there's a future? I mean, I bet he probably regrets now that he left, I presume. I don't know.
I don't. Richard would never say that he, in my opinion, that he regrets it. He was definitely pushed out. Bob Duggan was attracted to Pharmacyclics for a couple reasons. The big one was that it was developing a brain cancer drug, which is the reason that Pharmacyclics was initially founded. And Bob Duggan's son had died from brain cancer. It was glioblastoma. It wasn't really, although they did have a trial in glioblastoma, it wasn't the chief area that they were looking at. But he definitely felt a connection to what Pharmacyclics was trying to do, and he believed strongly in this drug. Of course, he had no scientific background at all. In fact, he never graduated from college. But he just felt strongly about what they were trying to do, and Dr. Miller also felt strongly about what he was trying to do. And some people in the biotech industry thought he had kind of lost his mind because he was pushing so hard for this drug, kind of even though the FDA, kept kind of telling him no. He wouldn't take no for an answer, but ultimately he did take no for an answer, and Duggan didn't like that, and so he tried to take control of the board and to control the company, and I think that Dr. Miller, really didn't want to keep working at the company as a CEO, kind of under Duggan's thumb in a way where it wasn't his board and he wasn't in control of things, and so he quit. My reporting was that while Duggan definitely wanted to make sure that the company continued to try to develop the brain cancer drug, and while Duggan was very serious about taking control of the company, that he actually didn't want Dr. Miller to leave. But he kind of, by being so forceful, he overplayed his hand a little. And on the eve of the financial crisis of all times, Dr. Miller did resign and left this company that was absolutely heading towards bankruptcy and would have filed for bankruptcy, in my opinion, had Duggan not rescued it.
I mean, and at some point their stock price was below $1.
58 cents, I think it was.
And
it ends up at $262. This is one of the greatest trades in the history of Wall Street.
It's amazing. I want to talk a little bit about Wall Street, and I would call it the vicious part of investment. But before I do that, I want to talk about Ahmed Hamdi a little bit. You obviously, he's a very important character in the book. He's a urologist, became chief medical officer. I kind of sense that you really liked him and you really felt bad for him. That was my sense as the author. As you got to learn, him and you interview him and so forth, I felt that you had a lot of sympathy for him because he was pushed out of pharmacyclics. He was not given credit on the paper that came in the New England Journal of Medicine. He was also not treated fairly at Acerta, kind of. He was accused being a urologist, not a medical oncologist. So there's a lot that as you being the author, I felt that you really had a lot of sympathy to this character in the book. Tell me your conversations with him, and am I onto something that you really had some affinity towards him because of how he was treated?
Well, first of all, Ahmed's a very sweet man, and so I think that most people who would spend time with him would like him. In fact, I think and I say this in the book, I think it's one of his great qualities. It's really important for the role that he was playing at Pharmacyclics and at Acerta at certain points. It's actually really important for people to like you and to respond to you and help you. And he definitely was good at that. I think Ahmed's played an enormous, very important role in bringing these drugs to patients. And I wanted to tell that story, and it's a hard story. The way I look at it is, here's a guy who grew up in Egypt, and he was just pulled west, first to the United States. He lands in Atlanta, and then he keeps going west, right? And finally Colorado, and then he ends up in California, in the kind of Silicon Valley area, the birthplace of biotechnology. Genentech was founded in South San Francisco and kind of started this whole biotechnology revolution that's been really so profound. And I think what Ahmed, my take on it, he was really enticed by this idea. He's very much into scientific advancement and scientific knowledge and doing good things for patients. And I think he also was very interested in making money. And I think that's what a lot of people find interesting about this kind of industry, which is that you can do all those things. You can have a nice life and also work hard and make tremendous contributions. And he wanted to be a part of it. And the problem or the issue that he confronts is that it's really hard. This is really hard stuff. It's not easy. There's a lot on the line. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of money. There are a lot of big personalities that he has to deal with when he's going through this journey, and it's really hard to navigate. It's not simple. And the one thing that I really admire about Ahmed is that he just keeps going. No matter what setbacks he's dealt, no matter what the discouraging, he has wins, he has losses. The losses make the wins, I think, more sweet, but it's all very hard. And nevertheless, he keeps going, and he still today, he recently founded a company, is now CEO of it, a biotechnology company. And he continues to try and learn from his past mistakes, as he says, and try to do good things for patients.
I interviewed one time on my podcast one of the VC investors, and I talked to him about all the pitches that he gets, obviously, to invest money, and gets about 2,500 a year. But one of the things that he told me, that in addition to investing in the product, he invests in people. And he really wants to get to know the people and the leaders of the company. And I'll say that, as I got to know Ahmed through your book and through your lens, I'd invest in him. Like, he just seems driven, and he really wants to do the right thing. Now, whether this really translates into success in his company or not, it's yet to be known. But it's strange that Duggan at some point was a big fan of Hamdi. He recruited him and he liked him a lot. And then suddenly he got pushed and got fired from pharmaceutics. And it seems that this decision was forced onto Duggan by his board and Genentech executives, as you described them. And my question to you is, Duggan did not strike me as somebody who would be pushed around. Like, I couldn't think that, he went to an ASH meeting with a fur coat, walking around. I didn't think anybody could convince him to do anything he did not want to do. What happened there? Like, how did this fallout happen? I was very I was surprised by that.
So I don't think anyone can tell Bob Duggan what to do. He only does what he wants to do. And in this case, just to be clear, while I did speak to Duggan while reporting this book, he never explained to me specifically why he fired Ahmed. But through other reporting, I kind of came up with my take on it. I mean, what I'm pretty confident is what happened, which is that Bob had a dilemma where he had, there was some advancement in the ibrutinib development process. It was still very early on. It was really still unclear what was going on. And he had started to bring in some other people, including some people who had previously been at Genentech, into the company. And those people sort of clashed a little bit with Ahmed on different issues, which I go into in the book a little bit. They didn't see eye to eye on a professional level, like this. They also were a little suspicious of him, or because he was a urologist and by training, and pharmaceutics at that point was starting to move towards blood cancer and oncology, and so that was also an issue. Ahmed would always say that throughout his career in biotech, he had a lot of experience working in a lot of different therapeutic areas, and he knew how to pivot. But nevertheless, I think from my reporting, what happened was that Duggan kind of came to the conclusion that these two camps, as I kind of look at it, weren't going to be able to work well together, and he had to make a decision about which one he wanted to move forward. And being an unsentimental business person, he kind of made the best decision he could at the time, which was to keep one group and get rid of the other. And as I report in the book, Duggan fires a lot of people. There were a lot of people, who were let go at pharmaceutics. There was no such thing as tenure at pharmaceutics. When he would feel that decisions had to be made, he would make them, and that's what happened here.
Another very colorful character in the book is Wayne Rothbaum, who is an investor on Wall Street. Did you know Wayne from before, from your reporting days, like before the book, I guess, as just a reporter for Forbes?
Yeah, so I had heard about, part of the reason I became interested in this book is because I wanted to report about Wayne Rothbaum, who is really a legend in biotech investing circles, and was an absolute mystery. No one had ever written about him. He completely under the radar by design. He's a very paranoid personality. He likes his privacy. And so as a journalist, that's interesting. Here's a legend that no one's ever really written about. And it took me a long time to get him to talk to me because he didn't normally speak with journalists. But ultimately I got him to speak with me, and we had many conversations, and I was able to report his role in this story, and also generally his career.
What's also interesting, Nathan, is that even somebody like Wayne, who is, like you said, a veteran. I mean, and who's a smart, obviously, investor. You could totally tell us some of the investments or decisions have an emotional twist to them. I mean, he was pissed off that he got out of pharmaceuticals too early and had so much money on the table. And that being pissed off led him to invest in the other company that was competing against. So some of this, like there's an emotional component to it where no matter, even if you're a billionaire and make a lot of money, you feel like you want to be right all the time, and if you're wrong a little bit, you get upset. And some of these decisions are reactionary. Did you were you surprised by that?
No, I've been covering
That's to be
people
expected.
like yeah, well, we are all human beings. This is, look, at its core, this is a human story about human beings, right? And human beings feel things. They are emotional about things, particularly things that they invest a lot of their time or money in. So that doesn't surprise me at all. It would surprise me if someone could stay cold and completely stay unemotional about everything that they did in life. I'm a big, the companies that I write about in this book and the investors are relatively small, right? There were biotechnology companies and hedge funds that were relatively small. Later, big pharmaceutical companies get involved. And I'm a big believer in the Mitt Romney school that, companies are just artificial creations. What are they? They're people, like people in them who are doing things and making decisions. And of course, emotion is going to play a role in what they do.
Yeah, I mean, emotions and luck, and another story pivoting into the Acerta story, which is the company that made that drug, the acalabrutinib, that competes with ibrutinib, and I've used both. There's a luck component of this, right? I mean, what was the Merck story with this? Because in one of the, there's one actually struck me, and I was laughing at this. You talk about Merck's luck in maintaining Kitruda and how they actually lost. I mean, literally, you says, for all intents and purposes, Merck was Kitruda. That Merck ever acquired and retained the drug came down to dumb luck.
Absolutely. We talked about forgotten drugs before, and we talked about how acalabrutinib was purchased from Merck for $1,000 up front. And acalabrutinib was created in a tiny town in the Netherlands called Oss, where there was this company called Organon, which actually had a really incredible history in pharmaceutical development. And through a bunch of mergers and divestments over many years, Organon gets acquired by Merck, which is totally uninterested in it. In fact, the moment they acquire it, they're starting to try to think of, how do we get rid of this Dutch outpost? We're not interested in it at all. And they literally start shutting it down. And this creates a lot of problems in the Netherlands. There are like protests in the street about the big bad American company that's shutting down this historic, Dutch company. And at the time, acalabrutinib was being developed in Oss at this facility that Organon had, and in the same building, with some of the same people, they were also developing a PD-1 that we now know as Kitruda. And while acalabrutinib was sold for $1,000 up front, Kitruda at one point was on a term sheet and they were looking to Merck was looking to get rid of it, and it was on a term sheet. And my understanding, and I say this in the book, for really a small amount of money. And then at the last moment, someone at Merck figured out that this was going to be a bad idea, and stopped the deal. So Kitruda is like, I look at it as a forgotten drug that at the last moment someone remembered about, and now it's Merck. That it's the most important product that the company, and the company would not be anywhere near what it is today without it.
Hands
And
down.
of course, it has made such a huge difference for patients.
Absolutely. Even the acquisition of AbbVie for pharmaceutics. Also, it came again. I mean, it seems to me from reading this, the CEO of AbbVie, he was losing Humira's revenues, and let me look around, let me shop around, and I'll buy this. And it was just, I don't know, it was, I don't know if it was luck, but certainly the motivation was I need a replacement for my drug.
Yeah, that was a strategic effort at AbbVie, which is a very large conglomerate that had a problem. What do you do when your biggest product, which is the $20 billion a year drug, is headed towards being a generic? What do you do when you have to try to replace it? And they came up with the best strategies they could, and one of them was to try and acquire a drug that could uh, replace some of those revenues. And Imbruvica, ibrutinib, was one of the only drugs available, and they paid an enormous sum. Enormous. It's almost hard to fathom. I think it was the peak of the biotech boom, in my opinion, because here you had AbbVie purchasing pharmaceutics, which owned 50%. Remember, not the whole thing. 50% of one blood cancer drug, ibrutinib, for $21 billion. So that implication is that the drug itself at the time was worth $42 billion. And to put that in perspective, a couple of years before pharmaceutics was bought by AbbVie, Genentech, which was the foundational biotech company, the whole company was sold for $47 billion. So you have half of one drug worth as much almost as Genentech. So it was a big bet, and increasingly one that I think doesn't look good from a financial perspective for AbbVie.
The other thing that is really interesting, and I curious your thoughts. I mean, the regulatory aspect and getting drug through the approval process is not easy, and I think it takes a lot. And as you articulated, many of these drugs never even make it to market, and they make it to market and they fail. Um, you know, it's and a lot of folks out there sometimes have issues and with the regulatory components and what the FDA what's as a reporter, how do you assess what the FDA is doing and how they're already managing this plethora of drug coming in going on?
I think I'm very sympathetic. That's the answer. I think the FDA has an incredibly difficult job. There's a lot riding on their decisions. It's not easy. And I kind of look at it as like a pendulum. It kind of swings around. Like I think in the period where the events in this book took place, you have an FDA that's becoming more accommodating, working a little bit more aggressively to find ways to help industry bring drugs to patients. Congress is also helping them do it at the time, enacting legislation that can help create regulatory pathways that weren't there before. And part of this was personal. I talk about Richard Pazdur and his evolution, and he heads the office at the FDA that determines which drugs get approved and not approved. And he's a human being, right? And I think I reported in the book, he's kind of impacted over the course of his tenure there. When he starts at the FDA, he kind of gains this reputation as Dr. No. He's really, it's hard to get cancer drugs approved through the Richard Pazdur's office. And then he goes through a personal evolution that includes his wife getting cancer and ultimately dying of cancer. And that changes him. And he becomes a little bit more aggressive in trying to find ways to help companies get good drugs to patients. Now I think we're kind of moving in the other direction, where I think the FDA is becoming kind of reached a peak with COVID, right, where they did everything they could to get the vaccines and the therapeutics to people as quickly as possible. FDA officials and hardworking employees working nonstop every day to try and do that. And now I feel like we're going into a different era where I think it's going to be a little harder, and the FDA is going to be a little less accommodating. All of these, and all for legitimate reasons. I quote Pazdur in the book saying, we're in an impossible position. I've lived it. Like either you're approving drugs too fast or you're approving drugs too slow. But we try, and he says in the book, he says this to balance this efficacy and safety thing, and it's really impossible to get right. So again, to answer your question, I have a lot of empathy for the challenge that they have.
But also designing these trials for the regulatory approval is not easy. I mean, you brought so many examples from the Resonate trials, the control arm. Do I do ofatumumab? What happens? Can we do crossover? I mean, there's so many things that happen that the design of clinical trials and taking them to execution is really not for the faint of heart.
No, I think it's a really important part of the drug development process. You can chemically, conceive of a drug, create it, but if the rest of the process isn't handled correctly, especially the clinical trial process isn't handled correctly, that drug's not going to get to patients. And it's really hard decisions. As I said before, sometimes you really only have one shot, and if it doesn't work, someone might not fund the second shot. So the decisions are really hard to make, and you have to try and figure out how to do it. And I decided to include all that in the book, even though some people told me I was crazy, that no one would ever want to read about regulatory processes. But I felt it was so integral, I didn't know how to avoid it. And when you really look at them, they're really kind of fascinating choices that people have to make.
I actually wanted to, I'm glad you covered those. This is really important because I think for patient care, you need collaboration between physicians, investigators, pharmaceutical companies and manufacturers, regulators, and patient advocate groups. We are all going to be patients, and I don't think it's fair sometimes to just throw all of the pharmaceutical companies that they are evil, the evil empire, because you see that on social media and a lot of places, and I don't think it's really fair. Frankly, I will go and say that there is no academic institution that would have designed or developed ibrutinib. So we owe that to these companies. I mean, that's what it is.
I agree with what you're saying. Ibrutinib is an interesting example because, of course, public, government funding of early research has been so integral to so many drugs that end up getting produced, but not here. This was really the private sector from the beginning to the end that drove this process of BTK inhibitors. And look, when it comes, part of the issue for the farm, there was an infamous poll that was made before the pandemic. So there's not having to do with the pandemic. That did an opinion poll in the United States about industries and how people view them, and in an incredible outcome, the pharmaceutical industry came below the tobacco industry, which is really crazy when you think about it. And the reason for that is very clear. There's a lot of outrage in the United States about the high cost of medications, a lot of outrage. And it's just a real issue because that outrage means that the pharmaceutical companies lose a lot of trust on other issues as well, and are seen as villains sometimes, as you say. So that's a really tricky public policy issue in the United States.
So you've been very generous with your time. I promise I'll let you go just in a couple of minutes. I just wanna, I don't know. I mean, what surprised you the most? I mean, you have so many characters and incidents, and you obviously, I mean, you reported on this. So probably some of the things that surprised me did not surprise you. But as a reporter, as a journalist, as an investigative journalist, and as a book author, what really surprised you the most? Are there like 2-3 things that stand out?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to answer your question this way. I wanted to show, in as honest a way as I could, the unvarnished truth of how drugs get, game-changing drugs get to patients, and the highs and lows of that process, the winners, the losers, as much as possible, in as truthful a way as possible. And The Economist a couple weeks ago wrote a very generous review of my book, and I thought the reviewer asked a really great question. At the end of the reviewer said, "Look, I've read this book, and I'll, At the end of it, there's got to be a better way," he asks. There's got to be a better way to develop cancer drugs than this cash-soaked, testosterone-fueled process, right? There must be, right? Is this really the way as a society that we're going to do it? And, my answer to that, it's a great question, and there may be other ways, but this one actually we know works, right? We know what those 400 drugs that were approved between 2010 and 2020, those are, not all of them are great, but those, some of them are like this, the BTK inhibitors really have made a difference. And so I guess what kind of surprised me is just learning about, really living what that process, to the extent that I can as an outsider, what that process looks like, and then trying to think about what a different process might look like. And it's really hard for me because to me, the risk reward part of this, I call my book For Blood and Money, and that's because I do believe that the money plays a really important role in people's motivations, in funding the drugs, in funding the research, all these things. And I have a hard time imagining other sorts of approaches. The Chinese model, they don't produce these kinds of drugs, right? They're not able to do it. In fact, the Chinese biotechs that exist, like Beijing, which is also, I didn't really write about them, but is connected to this story. They make the same risk reward decisions as all the other companies. They're in the stock market, getting financing and making the exact same decision. So it's kind of surprising to think about how hard it would be to imagine a different way of doing this, which really gets to the heart of the public policy debates around drug development.
It's a fascinating read, really, really, truly fascinating read. And there's so many similar stories probably happening in Wall Street, and I think this book obviously is already extremely successful. It's going to continue to be successful. You're probably going to write another book at some point. I think there will be a lot.
Not for a while. I'm taking a break.
No, you have to take a break. But I think, and I think the market is hungry for stories like this because we don't really know. I mean, I learned so much about venture capitalism and investment and Wall Street. I understand the physician side, but I didn't really know what happens behind closed doors and in the boardrooms, and people just push. Rothbaum at some point, he demands answers. Like, he picks up the phone like, "I want answers today," and people shake. It's just fascinating to me. And
what was most surprising for you in reading the book?
I did not realize how much influence the investors have on the science. I understood that they obviously need to fund the science, no question, right? I mean, they give the money, but I was a little bit surprised that they could even interfere in the design of a study. Like, Hamdi at some point will need to talk to Rothbaum about twice a day dosing and whether you inhibit the target. I'm thinking, well, this guy gave money to fund the science, and then he needs to step out. That was really surprising to me. The same with
Rothbaum, as you read in the book, he's on the peer-reviewed papers. He's an author. He's a co-author for the calibrutinib studies.
But that surprised me. Even Duggan also. Mm-hmm. So that piece I really was surprised about.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your interest in the book and how much you enjoyed it. So thank you so much, and it was just so much fun to talk with you here today.
Nathan Bardi, the author of For Blood and Money. Thank you so much for coming on Healthcare Unfiltered.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.